Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode with Robbie Barwick. And we are here for a very important update with breaking news on Dan Duggan. If you don't know who Dan Duggan is, stay tuned. We can explain that a little bit more, but a lot of my subscribers already know about him. So we'll be bringing that breaking news to you. And of course, we will supply a link for freedanduggan.org where you can help out also. But first things first, let's jump into this. Robbie, just in case anybody on my channel isn't familiar with the Dan Duggan case, can you give us a really quick overview?
Yep. Hi, Daniel. Dan Duggan is an Australian citizen, but he's a naturalized Australian citizen. He was an American Marine Top Gun pilot who met an Australian girl, fell in love. So he moved to, he got an honourable discharge from the US Navy, moved to Australia, started a business. That was in 2002, and in 2012 he became a naturalized Australian citizen. Later that year he went to South Africa and did what many ex-military people do, especially pilots, which is use their skills in the civilian sector. And he spent a little bit of time providing specialist training at the Test Flight Academy of South Africa, which is a specialized flight training school for civilian test pilots. And these are people who evaluate the performance and safety of aircraft, right? So they're very important for the aircraft industry. Some of them, Daniel, were Chinese, which is no surprise because China from way back then was the fastest growing airline sector in the world, right? And so there were Chinese test pilots there that Daniel Duggan helped to train. In 5 years later, in the United States, there was a new government come in, the Trump administration, and they impaneled a grand jury to try and to indict Dan Duggan for charges that they said he was in breach of their trafficking in arms regulations. But curiously and suspiciously, they rushed to do it just before the statute of limitations expired on those particular charges. They had known, the US government had known all along from 2012 to 2017 what he'd done, right? They also knew that lots of other pilots were involved in it from Australia, especially from the UK, etc. Only Dan Duggan has been charged. And of course, this coincided, for those of us who've watched the politics, the geopolitics involving China and the United States, there was a definite shift just before that of the United States really ramping up hostilities against China. And so they indicted Dan Duggan on these charges of breaching their trafficking in arms regulations. However, Dan Duggan was living in China by then because he had a consulting business to the Chinese aircraft industry, airline industry. He didn't come back to Australia until 2022. And in fact, he was lured back to Australia because one of our intelligence agencies said he had to return so he could renew a license. When he got here, the Americans put in a formal request for him to be arrested and extradited. The Australians acted on that straight away. He was arrested in October 2022. He has been in prison in Australia ever since without any Australian charges. It's more than 3 years and 6 months now without any Australian charges, fighting his extradition to the United States. And that fight has involved numerous court appearances, and we're here to update people on what happened at the last one and how truly shocking the decision was.
Right. Yeah. And so they also cut off his finances also early on to try to prevent him from being able to mount any sort of a reasonable defense. So how about we get into the specifics on how this is really an outrage for Australia specifically, the precedent it sets, and how they're basically throwing one of their own under the bus.
Well, and to start, let's break the news about the decision. So two weeks ago, a justice of the federal court, Justice Elios, rejected Dan Duggan's appeal that he'd heard 6 months earlier. And it was around the time when you and I met in person in Chongqing, and we talked about Dan Duggan because you knew the hearing had just happened, and I was in China at that time. Yeah. So it took 6 months for the decision. The appeal was based on this, and this is very important. This shows you, this is what's so shocking about it. Dan Duggan was appealing the fact that in order to meet the most fundamental requirement under law for an extradition, in Australian law, but it's a kind of a universal thing around the world. The most fundamental requirement is called dual criminality. It must be a crime in both countries for someone to be extradited for a crime that one country is chasing them for. In order to meet that requirement, the Australian government knew that what he was accused of by the Americans was not a crime in Australia in 2012. So they applied a 2018 law retrospectively to what the Americans accused him of in 2012. And Dan Duggan appealed that administrative decision to apply a law retrospectively. And Justice Stelios, the judge, ruled in favor against Dan Duggan and in favor of the Australian government. And you know what his reasoning was? It was very convoluted and waffly because you get to read these rulings. But his reasoning was that it was okay for the Australian government to apply a law retrospectively because the Extradition Act does not explicitly say that it can't apply a law retrospectively. That was the basis for him knocking back Dan Duggan's appeal and upholding the government's position. Now, we're a Western liberal democracy, Daniel, and that means we have a separation of powers between the government and the judiciary, and that means there's absolutely no interference in judicial decisions behind the scenes. Absolutely none. You can bet your life on it. And if you can't tell I'm being sarcastic, you need to get to know me better, because I am very skeptical about these claims. In Australia, one of the ways they do it is they provide judges with security clearances for these national security cases, and there's plenty of ways that they can be influenced. Anyway, nevertheless, he upheld that the government could use a law retrospectively. Retrospective law is prohibited in Australia. It is prohibited in the United States, but for administrative purposes of the Extradition Act, it has been ruled that it's okay to use it in Dan Duggan's case. And that is the Australian government. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So simply because the extradition bill doesn't explicitly say that they can't use forbidden techniques, they're using a forbidden technique because the general rule is you can't do that. So why would you even think to include that in the extradition bill, right?
Yep. Well, it turns out there is really strong grounds to believe that this was for want of a better word, a conspiracy between the two governments all along, going back to that 2017 indictment, because Trump is inaugurated, his administration comes into power. Whoever had this in the Department of Justice wanted to get Dan Duggan and make an example of him for their agenda to basically destroy the economic relationship between the United States and China, Australia and China, etc. Right? Neoconservatives were calling for this decoupling from China. So whoever wanted to do that was aware that the statute of limitations was running out. So they quickly impaneled this grand jury, and then the prosecutors who in charge of the grand jury did something quite extraordinary. They basically asked for a timeout on the statute of limitations. It's called a tolling period. They requested a tolling period, and that allowed them to suspend the clock on the statute of limitations so they could request, officially they said, request more information from the Australian government. Now, this fact of request for a tolling period is available in the court documents that have already been submitted by the American side in Dan's cases, right? So we know about it. What we don't know is the details of what they requested. Everybody who's familiar with this case is convinced that what they requested was Australia pass a law that could meet the requirement of dual criminality. That's what they requested, because they knew that there was no law. Australia had no laws similar to these trafficking in arms regulations that America has. And so they made the request. Australia had a law being prepared that was being lobbied for by our friends at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Daniel, ASPI, and it was called the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act. They whacked on a section 83 to that act that basically included training of foreign militaries, right, in that act. The wording is so specific. It's as if it was written for what Dan did, right? And
Yep.
as soon as the Americans knew that bill was drafted and underway, it wasn't. They sealed the indictment, and the plan was from 2017 all along to use that law to meet this requirement. But they needed an accomplice. They needed a co-conspirator, and that was the Australian government. Because the Australian government, a different party, by the way, it doesn't matter. All Australian governments are subservient to the United States. So that government, the Turnbull government from the Liberal Party, facilitated the passing of that law. And then in 2022, the current Albanese government applied it for the purposes of Dan's extradition.
That's really remarkable. The entire system is being manipulated specifically to make a case against Dan. There's no way that organically, with the existing laws and systems that Australia had, that there would even be a case to begin with. But this is an active collusion to create the conditions required to bring Dan in. And I think I remember you telling me before that there was somebody who had said something very revealing, probably inadvertently, in your Justice Department. I can't remember if you said it was the Attorney General or whoever it was, but you said that, you can correct me in a second, that they said that they can't do anything about it. It's out of their hands, when technically it shouldn't be. That is exactly the person's whose hands it's in, and they absolutely should have the power to reject it. But that revealed something, that there was something higher up going on behind the scenes that prevented them from using those legitimate powers.
So in law, the buck stops with them. They have all the power they like. The Attorney General of Australia can end this misery tomorrow. But it was the Attorney General has more than once has replied in writing to people saying that there's nothing that they can do about it. And that is them, you're right, reflecting a political reality in their head. Oh, we cannot buck the Americans. And we might have talked about this before, but I'm gonna tell you the story again, just to emphasize it. Our current Prime Minister is someone who his whole political career in Parliament, he was elected in 1996, so he's been in there 30 years, was known to be someone who was a fierce advocate of Palestinian rights. This is just an example, right? So he's Prime Minister when October 7, 2023 happens, and the aftermath of the genocide in Gaza. He has refused to do anything to express anything like his previous positions on the question of Palestine, despite all the awful things that we've seen. I spoke to one of his colleagues who was in the pro-Palestine camp with him about 2 years ago, and I said to her, everyone wants to know what's happened to Anthony Albanese. Why has he changed his position on Palestine? This is a verbatim quote, her reply. She said, he still has the same views, but now that he is the leader, he has to show he is loyal to the United States. And what's almost most shocking about that statement is she accepted that as just the way it is. This is how subservient this country has become to the United States. And so in the case of poor Dan Duggan, right, didn't have a prayer, unfortunately, unless we can change the politics of it, right? Like we did with Assange. There was a turning point with Assange, Julian Assange, where the public disgust at the American treatment of him and how long he'd been incarcerated, etc., changed the calculus for politicians, and they were prepared to do something stronger. There's a lot of public disgust in Australia about Donald Trump and the consequence of this stupid war in Iran and just what a blithering idiot he is, etc. It is really doing enormous damage to Australia's relationship with the United States. Even some of our friends in the Aspie crowd are starting to become very critical of it because they see all their life's work being flushed down the toilet, right? Because of just the insanity of it. And so that's, in my view, Daniel, that's my hope that there's an opportunity here that if we hit this hard enough and keep supporting the Duggan family, we may be able to change the politics of it. Because if we can't do that and keep them here, I hold grave fears for what he's going to end up being exposed to over there.
Yeah, and the precedent it sets also. I mean, first of all, to address the thing about your current leader and his previous views, I mean, you see that happening all the time in the US and all around the world. People have realized that, people say one thing and then they get into office and they become a shell of their former self,
Yep.
at least publicly facing. Even, like on the US side, you have Tulsi Gabbard. You can see that,
Yeah.
how against all these wars she was. And then now she's just basically justifying everything that's going on. It's like, it is bizarre and it is pathetic. And you would hope that that was isolated to America, but obviously it's not. It happens in Australia, and perhaps it's even worse because it happens in Australia in order to subjugate themselves to the same pathetic power that I was just talking about earlier on. And the amount of conditioning that must have gone on in the Australian public to make this happen is unbelievable. Because if you were to imagine if a quote unquote pro-China party came to power in Australia and were doing exactly the same things with China in order to extradite someone from Australia, an Australian citizen, to China, never mind if he was a Chinese citizen before or whatever, that would be outrageous. There is no way anybody would stand for that. But instead, you have Australian people being fear-mongered into fearing China over imagined threats that don't even exist, theoreticals, while this is going on with an actual Australian citizen right in front of people's faces, showing how your own government will sell you out in order to subjugate themselves to the American government. That's the real threat to Australian people. And even if you're not so sure about Dan Duggan himself, or if you like that is the implication. Like if not enough noise is made about this, they're going to be able to do this again and again to whoever they want.
Well, I got involved, and the Citizens Party got involved in this case straight away as soon as the arrest happened and we heard it was reported, not because we knew anything about it. We didn't know if Dan Duggan was innocent or guilty or anything. We got involved because we had been so heavily involved in combating the anti-China disinformation and the climate, the McCarthyite climate of hysteria that had been created here by these American-funded organizations, actually, as we know, like ASPI. What we knew in principle was that he would never get a fair treatment either in Australia or in the United States, right? And so we thought, just from that standpoint alone, someone needs to advocate and look at the case and say, what's the other side of this story, right? Because none of that was going to otherwise get out. So since 2022, when he got arrested, we worked very hard to do that, and I can see the results, right? People are starting to get it, and so. And of course, like I said, Trump's thanks to Trump, America's standing is well and truly declining in Australia. Support for China, like people are having more positive views about China, just because whatever they were told about China has never caused us any of the grief that the United States is causing at the moment. Our Prime Minister in this current mode he's in, as soon as Donald Trump illegally attacked Iran on the 28th of February, he was the first leader of any nation in the world to run out and endorse the war. And now he regrets it. You can tell he regrets it, but he can't take it back, right? But he's well and truly changed his wording, because turns out our country is more reliant on supply chains. We're at the end of all the world's supply chains down here, Daniel. We're not on a junction on the way through to Antarctica, right? We're the end of the line, and we have a smaller fuel reserve. We're not self-sufficient in oil. We have a smaller fuel reserve than any other country in the world by far. It's ridiculous. We're the biggest consumers per capita of diesel, but we have the smallest fuel reserve because our leaders have been crazy for too long and ignored warnings that we need to have a proper reserve. So we've been really, really nervous as a result of this war. It's blowing up in the face, and the government they really regret rushing out so fast to endorse it. But why do they do it? They did it because they have been so conditioned to instinctively back everything the United States does. And this particular one has blown up in their face.
Yeah. This is what people should really care about. I mean, I think if you look at Dan's story itself, it's tragic. He has a big family, has many kids. And there's a lot of people who are going to care about Dan. But if for whatever reason you're not really an empathetic person, you don't even have to care about that. You don't even have to think he's innocent. The fact that you can see how the system is being manipulated around him in order to make this happen, and for whom they're doing it for and how they're doing it, that is the thing that every single Australian should care about, whether they're empathetic on a personal level or not for Dan.
Well, and Daniel, you have looked more than most people at the sort of like the body of accusations and insinuations about Dan Duggan that's out there and circulating, right? And so
Right.
people are probably right to say, well, this should be tested in a trial, maybe, and all those accusations tested in a trial. But the one thing you've got to understand, if you have any appreciation of sovereignty, you have to understand that the only thing that's relevant is not all. There's a lot of gossip out there, and we can talk about some of the specifics. But the only thing that's relevant to Dan's case is the 4 charges made against him. The 4 charges listed in the US indictment. That's all that's relevant, because the indictment's about 60 pages long all up, and there's about a page covering the charges, and then there's all these other pages talking about all this other stuff, talking about what he did in China when he was there, how. Like one of the there's information there about how far he lived from a US aircraft, like a Chinese aircraft carrier, and just to make it look suspicious, even though that has nothing to do with the charges against him. They just added it in there just to sort of con the grand jury, right, into thinking that there was something there. But so in law, all that matters is those charges, and that's why it comes down to the Australian government abiding by its own law, which is dual criminality.
Right.
Right. Yep. And because they didn't, in order to please the United States, that shows you that this is fundamentally an issue about sovereignty. What sort of country do we have if we are so quick to twist the law,
right,
and in such a shocking way in order to please a foreign power?
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, that's the main thing. Is if somebody was saying, well, why not just let them test the case in front of the American government on American soil? If you're naive enough to believe that he would get a fair trial there to begin with, that aside, even if you wanted to see that happen, it requires giving up Australian sovereignty. It requires being complacent with chipping away at that even more in order to make that happen. So I think more people need to understand the implications of that. I think maybe we'll wrap it up there. But if you want to finish on some other final points, and also a reminder on how people can support, go ahead if you want to. Continue on.
Look, let me finish with a very heartfelt appeal to the viewers here. The Duggans need your help. They only get help from people who have an understanding of the bigger issue here and some sympathy, because they've been worse than abandoned by their government. They've been betrayed. This is a family with 6 children. 3 of them are just below and just above 10 years of age. So those kids have not been with their father for 3 years and 6 months. A man who hasn't broken any Australian laws and he would argue hasn't broken US laws as well. But he's an Australian citizen and he's been betrayed by his country. You referred to it earlier. As part of the American campaign against him, not only did they put these charges on him and got him arrested, but they have blocked him from selling the family's number one asset, a property, to fund his legal defense. And remember, I explained to you the details. The money laundering charges, because in the 4 charges, one of them is money laundering, and these are things the American prosecutors just whack on there to boost the number of years that you can be sentenced for. It can only relate to what he was paid at this South African flight school, which is $160,000. And so the family wanted to sell their property, and they offered to quarantine that $160,000, right? So that if there's any sense of proceeds of crime, then that wouldn't be spent. But that wasn't good enough for the Americans. So they took the Duggans, they got the Australian government to take the Duggans to court and froze the sale of that asset. Now, because Dan's charges are American, he doesn't qualify for what we call legal aid in Australia, which is where you can get a public defender. He doesn't qualify for that. He can't sell his property. His family is $1 million in debt, trying to struggle through this. And to add insult to injury, when this judge upheld this principle of retrospectivity in the appeal 2 weeks ago, he awarded costs against the family. And so the family has to pay for the big team of lawyers the Australian government sent into court to argue against the appeal. This family, the wife and 6 kids, have to bear the costs of that because they don't have a breadwinner anymore. He's in prison, right? And then the biggest insult of all is everything the US government does in court here in relation to Dan Duggan case, I paid for as a taxpayer. The Australian government picks up all the bills, right? And it is just crushing, an innocent man. And you can take my word for it if you want. Go to the Citizens Party's website. We put out the details on there, but I know he's innocent of the charges. But what I fundamentally know is an Australian citizen who doesn't qualify for extradition. His whole life has been destroyed, and his family's life has been destroyed by a government subservient to the United States. So they will decide in a week from today. They had 28 days after the appeal. So a week from today is their deadline for them to decide whether they appeal again. And the thing with that appeal is they also have to weigh up whether the costs, whether they can afford it. And part of the picture, they're forced to introduce into their calculation the reality of, do we just bite the bullet and go with the extradition and fight the case in the United States, right? Which is a terrible position they've been forced into. So to help them, they only get help from their fellow Australians. Please go to freedanduggan.org and be as generous as you can. Make a contribution. There's a number of different platforms there that they list where you can contribute to them, including directly through a bank account. But if you can help, please do, because what you're helping is not just, as you said, Daniel, it's not just for the family. You're helping to fight for a principle here. These people are symbols of our lack of sovereignty in this country. That's why the Citizens Party is fighting for them, and you can fight for that too.
Absolutely. That's some really important information. And if that does happen, if they do bite the bullet and he goes over to the US, there is one portion of the case that is lost forever. And that is the one that is most important and impactful to the Australian people. It is how the system was manipulated to make that extradition happen. There is no coming back from that. After he's gone, whatever happens in the actual case in America is one thing, but that piece of Australian history and what America can do to any Australian, how they can manipulate the Australian system, is already set in stone. That is a precedent that will continue to be used whenever they want to go after whoever they want in Australia. 100%. So, yeah, as I said, and as you said, you check out the website. I don't very often ask people to like and share, but, definitely the word needs to be put out there. There's only a week left. So let as many people as you know about this, spread the news, and let everybody know about what's happening to Australia's sovereignty throughout this case. So
Free Dan Duggan, freedanduggan.org. Freedanduggan.org.
Absolutely. I'll drop it in the description also. Thank you, everybody, for listening, joining, and Daniel, for any help that you guys can offer. Thanks again.
Thanks very much.
See you soon, Robbie.
Bye-bye.